Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Yeah, I hope you're surviving this very cold, South African evening. I don't know what it's like in the upper parts of the country, but down here in Cape Town, we are having a hard time. Jonathan actually doesn't live that far from me, so yeah. But honestly, if he has a pretty cool setup there with his with his fireplace and his very luxurious piano and so forth. So yeah, who am I to complain? Look at me in my white empty room here. But also, yeah, as usual, we just moved houses about a month ago. Everything's still just all over the place. So which is also why it sounds like I'm in the bathroom, because I'm crammed into like a little small room, like that no one should need to work in as an office, but that's how it goes. So apologies also for the sound on my side. Awesome, cool. So I'm happy to dive into this, but just a couple of questions and a couple of kind of housekeeping things. So first and foremost, it's mostly going to be me and Jonathan tonight. I'm mostly going to be running this show. So and as always, if you guys have any questions, just pop them in the text chat. Jonathan, I'll leave it up to you whether you actually pause at some point and we maybe chat about some of the questions, or at the end we do like a big set of questions. But yeah, you guys please do leave them in the text chat and we can work through them. Yeah, so just in terms of general FETSA admin, so we have a pretty busy couple of weeks coming up. So obviously we have tonight talk about Selenium, and then this weekend, for those of you that are in Cape Town, we actually have our first full day kind of workshop since COVID hit, which is super exciting. So for those of you that are in Cape Town, I definitely encourage you guys to join us on Saturday at Workshop 17 in the waterfront, where we're going to be working on an actual real product. Justin knows a couple of the people at the other radio, like a kind of a streaming service in Cape Town, and they are in need of a lot of front end and design love. They're one of those classic sites where they got someone on Upwork, some guy in some other country, like Poland or whatever, to build something for them, and it's falling apart now, and they don't know what to do. So there goes my lamp. Sorry about that, guys. So we just said, maybe if they just give us loads of pizza and free food and whatever, we can maybe just get together a couple of people, a couple of designers who can maybe just make some UX improvements, do some design changes, and a couple of front-end developers who can maybe just actually implement those. So it's a React site. I think we're looking at moving it over to Next.js. I think there's also kind of a Django admin backend that we're going to maybe transition to something like T now, or some headless CSS, headless CMS. Rest in peace, lamp. Okay. So, guys, in terms of everything going on in my life, the lamp is the least of my worries right now. Welcome to the Skulk Fenter Personal Show. Okay, welcome to my daily blogcast. But yeah, so definitely, if you're interested, even if you just come and hang out with us and chow pizza and whatever, and you're just I'm just here for the free food, please do pull through. I think it's just a great opportunity just to kind of network and kind of meet other lamp stack. That's originally what I thought when I mentioned Next.js, and someone said rest in peace lamp, and I was like, yeah, buddy, I feel you. It's been a while since I kind of set up some AfriHost, Linux shared host somewhere. But yeah, so please do pull through, even if you just come hang out with us. It's also a great opportunity to just network with some designers and things as well. Cool. And then next week, I think it's also Wednesday, we actually have the React Africa kind of event. So that has been silent for some time now. And so I met a really cool guy called Mike Murray. Hopefully he's here tonight as well. Just shout in the text chat if you're here, Mike. But I met him when I was up in Johannesburg at DevConf, and like he's actually been doing a lot of cool stuff, kind of in terms of React meetups and whatever. And we just asked him, hey, do you want to like just run the FedSA React meetup? So yeah, that's starting off again on Wednesday evening. And actually, I see whoever set up this event actually got the background banner wrong. So you'll see it actually says React Africa 23 August. So I'm just going to pretend that that's intentional and that's for marketing purposes. So this is just for marketing the next event. This isn't meant to show what the current event is. So there you have it. All right, so I've probably spoken enough. So I'm happy to just do a quick introduction of Jonathan and let him continue and do a much better introduction. So sure, Jonathan, I think the first time I met you was at CodeSpace, CodeBridge. Sure, a couple of years ago. Sure, that was probably like 3 years ago. I think Shaylin dragged you along there or something.
Yeah, it was pre-COVID.
Yes, sure. That's a lot. And I think you were just getting into development back then, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct.
So Jonathan is actually someone who actually made a career change. So I think your background is in accounting, is it not? Or
yeah, spot on.
Yeah. So, so he actually only started getting into development like maybe 3-4 years ago. And like, honestly, like, I'll just say this up front, and I'm probably going to embarrass you. But man, like, I think just the passion that you have for like development, and just like the energy that you bring, it's just amazing. I really love it. Like, it's whenever I speak to you about anything development related, I'm just so keen to just go write some code. I really appreciate that energy that you bring, and I'm really hoping that will also translate through this talk as well. And I hope you will like kind of provide the rest, everyone else joining with that as well. So I think you are still working with Wogan, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, I actually, yes, I did until end of May, and I joined the awesome peeps at Advantage Learn Technologies from June, and it's been a really good transition. The team's been welcoming, and I've learned so much already. They've got some brilliant patterns that they've implemented, and it's been a really good couple of months already with them.
Okay, awesome. And so, like, what is your specific role there?
I'm employed as a senior engineer with them. I'm specializing in data and software engineering. So kind of helping with the full stack dev, but also kind of pioneering any like DevOps data engineering kind of side of things.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So you guys have Jonathan, the senior like software engineer, coming to you straight tonight, getting it straight from the man himself. Cool. Yeah, that's super encouraging, and I think that also just once again speaks to just kind of this passion that you have for development and so forth. Given that even like 4 or 3 years ago, you were just like, I don't know anything about code, but can you tell me? Like, I'm here to learn. Okay, so all right, there you guys go. All right, but so I'm more than happy for you to just introduce yourself a bit more if you feel the need, and also just kind of give a bit of an overview in terms of what you're going to be talking about. As always, guys, please, any questions in the text chat, and then I'll just feed them to Jonathan as they come up and we have time. All right, cool. Yeah, it's all yours, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Skulk. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really honored to have some of your time this evening to dive into a topic that's quite near and dear to me. Specifically because this has been kind of a catalyst to the transition to, like Skulk mentioned, I had that accounting background, and I'll get into that a bit more, but after a decade of, climbing the corporate ladder, getting to what was essentially the top of it, this is what really got me to go, you know what, let's call it a day. Let's transition to something that just really speaks to me, that I've got a passion for, and that really makes me tick. And I'm hoping to actually share a bit of that tonight. As you can see on the screen, we've got the first slide there, robotic process automation. I was quite excited actually by the various kind of comms that went out, because I saw a lot of like emphasis on like using Selenium. I think at one stage, Skulk posted that, it was last Wednesday. I was also like prepared to talk last Wednesday, but then we figured out it was next Wednesday. So there was quite a bit of kind of back and forth, and I'm hoping a little bit of mystery, and I hope this is a bit of a curveball as well for this evening's talk. But the key here is just, what if you could engineer your presence to be absolutely obsolete? What if you could do your work but not have to be consciously involved with doing it, and yet things still get done when they need to get done? All right, but first I wanted to talk about, why talk about robotic process automation? What's in this kind of theme, and what's it all about? So essentially, robotic process automation involves either writing scripts or making use of software to automate certain repetitive tasks that we tend to do during our daily work lives. Especially if you consider that there are things that are very cyclical, like monthly reporting, daily emails. There's a lot of things that I bet we all know that we kind of tend to do in a cyclical nature, in a very repetitive manner, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly. But specifically why I thought this would be an interesting topic to come and share at FEDSA is because during my time of kind of working with like RPA solutions, there were certain types of UI and design thinking that, I picked up that warrants a lot of mundane and mindless work. And also, I wanted to kind of share these kind of pitfalls for us to consider when we are building our own user interfaces or our own systems out there. And especially, I'm hoping that, through recounting my story and my journey, with various user interfaces over the years, and especially finding spaces where RPA has been useful, I'm hoping that maybe there's some imparting of like good ideas in terms of taking it back to where you build. Also, what I wanted to share is just, there's this additional tool. I mean, we could always use an additional tool in our tool belt. I think most of us, if not all of us, are problem solvers at the core, and having another tool to potentially solve problems is always a great thing. Also wanted to share this because I think with RPA there is quite a bit of freedom when it comes to actually using these solutions, because we tend to kind of get stuck in this repetitive cycle. And this is kind of a solution to kind of automate that, to step away from that. I know internally where I'm at now, we tend to have a weekly and monthly focus on, how can we be more efficient with especially these kind of processes. So we try and connect systems so that there's automatic cross-syncing so that we don't have to do that manually. We try and use the workflow tools, and we recount and we account for those time savings. And I think it's an especially a liberating thing that if you know about this is something you could potentially share with colleagues, contacts, family, as something that they could look into. I mean, for me as an accountant, this was phenomenal. And it really allowed me to kind of step up and just keep developing myself, because I got to set myself free from a lot of the mundane work that kind of like took up most of my daily and weekly time. And then lastly, I just hope to inspire. There were, just from like insights gained from using it, this just showing you what can be done, or telling you about things that were won in the past. And I just hope to maybe just give you some, oomph for the next couple of weeks and months. And, we're getting to the end of the year, so everybody could use a little bit of extra energy. Awesome. So, the style of it coming up, I'm definitely not a RPA expert or a subject matter expert. I don't proclaim to be one. I'm just somebody that's had some experience with it, probably close to a decade. And it's something that I just wanted to share. I also didn't necessarily think to, come and present facts or anything like that. It's just purely, my story, which also kind of, I want to share my story. I wanted to bring you something that you couldn't Google necessarily, just how I worked with it and how it fit into my, past couple of years of work experience. because essentially I'm hoping that from this it could potentially give you some pointers to go and research. And there are most likely some great tutorials out there. I'll share some resources as well as towards the end, but that could be kind of sought after to necessarily get the hard skills. This is more the sales pitch. You could think of it like that. And as again, it's story time. So what I want to just do is I want to kind of run through my experience, a couple of years of working with it, and just kind of give you a couple of user stories, a couple of use cases where I use this, because I think that, over the years, and especially kind of recounting, where you are now and looking back at what you kind of done, you often see how far you've come. So there's a lot of like nuance in just, sharing like typical use cases. So first up, the mindset. And I love this quote. This is kind of been a quote that's been close to me for the longest time. And this is one from Bill Gates, and he says that he'll choose a lazy person to do a hard job because a lazy person will find an easy way to do it. And I always felt, because I've carried that burden a lot during school, being the lazy guy, right? And I always like this quote, because where laziness was always looked down on, I kind of took this quote and I was like, laziness, maybe it isn't always bad. And I think what the mindset is all about, it's identifying kind of, there's this phenomenon called BS jobs, right? Where jobs are created basically just to churn the mill, but we often ask ourselves, what's the purpose of those roles? What's the purpose of those jobs? And it's, there's a whole school of thinking around that. But this is all about how can we necessarily automate the mundane things that we continuously, repetitively do. And so I kind of thought back to where the original kind of thinking came from. And thank you so much to everyone that was able to do or participate and contribute to the questionnaire that I sent out earlier. So what this graph is essentially showing us is, for the attendees, how many of us had the misfortune of getting write-out work as punishment during school. And I specifically wanted to, for those of us that haven't had the pleasure and that might not know what it is as punishment, you would typically need to write out certain sentence to kind of like instill the desired behavior. So you would write out, I will not do X or Y because of this reason. And what I remember distinctly about this was that you had to essentially write 100 lines, and maybe you had one pen and you'd have to write, and you'd write 100 lines and it would take you an X amount of time. And I remember that we started thinking, but we can theoretically hold more than one pen in our hands, right? So eventually what you got to is okay, I can write 100 lines with 2 pens, which means I theoretically only write 50 lines. And I think at some stage, some of us were writing with like 4 pens. So you can, 25 times to write 100 lines. And so that's the earliest time that I could remember this kind of thinking coming from, which is like, okay, I need to do this, but how can I do it faster? What can I implement to essentially get the same output, but with a lot less input? And that's essentially kind of what the mindset is about. And that is, how can I move and do what I'm doing now a lot quicker? And that's essentially where I think it started building. And that's the mindset that you kind of set out when you kind of want to pursue the kind of robotic process automation side of things, is how can you make it faster, what you're doing. So after school, this is kind of like the articles period. This is where I joined an accounting firm. This was my first professional job many years ago. And I think one of the things that caught me back then was kind of for the first time ever kind of meeting this kind of like corporate that can be potentially stuck in its ways, right? Because what they've done in the past has always worked, and there's no time to do anything else. It's still working. And I found this cartoon especially applicable to that. So essentially, if you look at bringing improvements to the table, it tends to be ignored because the established ways are working. But what was really great about this time is I had to do certain processes on a daily basis. And this is kind of where it started kind of like churning again in my head, like how could this be done faster? So just as an example, a new clerk that enters an accounting practice, typically they are put on what we call capturing work. And so their main responsibility is to take physical documentation that's been printed out and essentially capture that back into the application or the accounting suite for reporting and record purposes. Now, one of those documents and one of those processes was an actual physical act of getting a 6-7 page or more bank statement with maybe 30, 50 transactions per page and needing to retype the date, the description, and the amount. And now this was quite some time back, and I think a lot of the firms have caught on. But back then, I used to do this on a daily basis. And after about the second or third month, you really ask yourself, isn't there a better way to do this? And so what was quite cool is some engineers had started thinking about this problem, or business or product owner or somebody that started thinking about this, and they built the feature where you could import bank feeds. Now this feels like such a common thing these days, and I almost feel like a financial product where you can't do that. Just it doesn't make sense. It's such a expected feature, but back then it was something new, and essentially there were a lot of concerns when this was pitched, and you'd say like, hey, can we adopt this? This looks like a lot faster and quicker way to do things. But again, you kind of had that thing where like, okay, but we've got people to capture these bank transactions. So, why would we want to do the bank feeds or, security concerns? But it was such a pleasure once we had actually adopted that. And we were so thankful that there was a feature, because now you kind of circumvented several to many problems because somebody had thought about this quicker way. And so you eliminate human error, you expedited the time that was needed to capture these things, and you essentially freed up a lot of the labor effort that went into sorting that out. And I was really thankful for that, but it was something typical. And you realize that sometimes, even though you come with new techniques and new ideas, that sometimes adoption is very difficult to motivate and to kind of justify and get right, essentially, especially if you aren't one of the key decision makers. Some other things that were really cool during this time is I really got into Excel in a big way, and I still love Excel very much. It's still one of those key cornerstone things that it's also, I think if my life had gone differently, I probably would have become like an Excel engineer. That would have been my story. But what was really cool, and this was also something that I think is quite something to think about when we build our products, and that is that sometimes our vendors of the software, when they build, they recognize that this kind of tedium can creep into what they're building, and so they give you kind of workflow tools, or in Excel's case, Excel gives you the ability to record yourself working, record your own workflows. So back then, and they're called macros, back then somebody actually said, because I explained, we had this process where the accounting suite would kick out a raw CSV file, and then it would be our job to kind of like mold that CSV file into a presentable report. But before we could send it out to the clients, it had to go to a senior's review. And from that kind of, you got a bunch of red notes back to say like, this is what you need to change, this is what's wrong. So you can already see there's a lot of human interaction and a lot of like additional bulk labor because of the process and the way that's been established. But hey, it's always worked, so that's how we did it. So as part of that, what kind of started to happen is you get to this point where you don't want review notes anymore. You want to deliver a perfect product to the reviewer every time, and they kind of churn it out and say like, hey, this is perfect, I've got no comments to do this. Which also coincidentally is quite a thing to strive for on our side, with like continuous integration and kind of like, how do we expedite what you call it, pull requests. Basically the reviews of pull requests is by checking what are the common mistakes and maybe putting linters and things in place for it. But yeah, that's maybe a conversation for another time. But essentially the process was that they'd review it, they'd send it back to me, and then you would learn what were the kind of pull for. And it used to be like pedantic things like, this line's not wide enough, or this heading is like maybe just 1-2 pixels. So this was the typical feedback you got. But what was quite nice is over the cycles and over the months, you kind of got to draw up a list of common things that you were doing wrong and that you could correct. And eventually you got kind of to an exhaustive list of things that you have to consistently check every single time. And enter, somebody said, you know what, why don't you look at macros? And so I started looking at macros. And essentially, like I explained, when you record a macro, it's essentially watching you work. It's storing that as a bit of script that's able to be executed on demand and do exactly what you would have done for that session. And it does it automatically. And what I ended up doing is I would record a macro for each one of the styling effects that you wanted to do. So what I ended up with was maybe, 10 different scripts that would do the 10 different formattings. But it would still kind of require my input. I would still need to drive each of the formatting, but it did still increase the turnaround time of those processes. And so kind of one of the greatest things I think during the articles that was quite interesting, there was a process where the senior partner, so this is the most senior accountant in the firm, they answered to kind of like the executive board. They were dealing with a process for the biggest client, and this process would typically take them 2 days, and it also kind of involved transitioning information from one system to another system. But it took them 2 days to do it. And so at that stage, having built up some sufficient Excel skills, I was able to kind of reduce it. I took it on for a bit. I said, hey, give it to me. Let me see what I can do with it. And we got that the 2-day process down to 5 hours, which was phenomenal, right? So you had your junior clerk that was able to do the senior partners, or able to kind of alleviate them from needing to spend those 2 days, and able to kind of shift the work down to your junior clerk and give them kind of to do it in 5 hours. But obviously at that stage, you were using some cool Excel techniques, and you were using macros. But I realized, and as time went on, right, you started realizing, wow, but I've still got to kind of drive these scripts, got to drive them, got to kind of get them to do things. And so one day I kind of started thinking, but what if I could chain these scripts one after the other, and I could click a single button, I could have them run sequentially, and the whole process just gets run. And so I figured out, but hey, you know what? Behind all of this, behind this kind of macro recording tool, there is a scripting language, and it is generating the code that is basically giving the program instructions on how to do things step by step. And once I opened up that, I realized, but hey, I could actually just copy paste, the various steps top to bottom, and I could actually chain it myself. And there's kind of, you're getting hands-on with code, you're kind of seeing what actually makes this thing move and churn, and it really makes you excited, because now you can start introducing little conditional logics and stuff. So this was really a great time for just starting to kind of get into like reading code and molding it to do what you needed to do. But in closing, so once all of this was done, I think by the time this process was as optimized as it could do, this 2-day process, basically took about a minute to run. So this 2-day process was reduced to a minute, because this script would just run through it, and it would churn, and it would do the necessary data parsing that it needed to do in a minute. And I always said it could be faster, but I was limited by the technology of my time. My processor could only go as fast. So it's really something that can recoup time. And what was awesome as well is, with the recoup time, we could invest it into further upskilling, which then also just yielded more results. So after articles, because typically after articles, after you earned about, maybe if you were lucky, 5,000 Rand a month, you're quite keen to get out of there, because you want to go and have a real job, or at least a real salary, or at least you want to get out there and start earning. So I kind of joined several firms, not out of practice. So these were companies, they were running businesses, and I kind of joined them, being part of their financial. And I was kind of expecting maybe it was just my accounting firm that was a bit stuck in its ways when I wanted to pitch into innovations, but I've just found more of it wherever I went. I worked for a company at one stage that had a department of financial individuals to basically drive a process that at that stage already, I think you could have done with one person if you just had the right understanding of your tools and some proper workflows. But this is sometimes what we see, right? Is the decision makers are in the space where they think something will just magically happen to make things, to change things. And so what was also obviously a big hamstrung is you encountered all the software which didn't necessarily have modern thinking, but they were quite entrenched in terms of where you were at. And what was great about these instances is you didn't necessarily, the software couldn't necessarily do the heavy work of automating things or connecting things. And in those instances, if you were able to write scripts that could interact with these software packages, you could write your own automation for it, and basically interface with them. So yes, and essentially because of you had these older software and there was older practices, it necessitates having a lot of people to do these kind of churning jobs. And also kind of when you get there, you've also got this reliance on physical documentation versus digital documentation, which also makes it more difficult to kind of automate things and expedite things when it comes to like processing and searching through documents and things like that. I remember specifically we had a payroll application, and when it comes to kind of payroll, what you're doing is you're capturing everybody's detail that works for the company, because you've got compliances, you need to run payroll every month, you've got all of these various things. And because of that, what often happens is you get software that's trying or that needs to do a lot from a compliance perspective. So as an example, and I actually thought about it again the other day, we had a screen where we had a workflow with a critical path where you wanted to capture a specific user, and you needed to capture all their biographical information, which made sense, right? We had that on hand. Maybe on the second user interface screen, you had to capture their banking details. But then there was at least another 6 to 8 screens, which would ordinarily require some information if you were in certain industries, or if the individual was perhaps a foreigner or things like this. But all of those screens necessitated, even though you didn't need them, still necessitated some form of input. And so what would typically happen is you would need to, on a single day, maybe you'd need to load 60 individuals. So yes, 100%. The first 2 screens, you need to kind of put the individual's details in, but then you need to spend a further 2 to 3 minutes kind of just in a kind of brain dead way, just kind of clicking through these user interface, just saying that it's not applicable, that there's no information that's relevant at this stage, and just kind of page on, page on, page on. Finally, to get to the point where you submit it to the application and it's stored, only then to go to the next record. So again, it was a great space for just like, even if I could just get something to do those mundane clicks after I'd finished maybe capturing the relevant information. And again, a little script over there and a little knowledge over there in terms of configuring something to do those clicks on my behalf made a difference, because it could click faster than I could. It could do it more accurately. And those, maybe then it was maybe 20 seconds. Those 20 seconds were at least spent, not having to consciously focus and burn out some energy in terms of staying active and present with the process. So yeah, it was quite interesting time, the kind of like post articles, which of course then I think brings me to the thickening. And this was, I think also, I'm glad Skulk mentioned where we met, because I think one of my favorite conversations with Skulk on kind of like the topic of robotic process automation, and specifically because I know we mentioned Selenium a bit, specifically kind of like using Selenium to automate things in the browser. Back then, obviously you're working with a web app, but maybe the web app doesn't have the necessary tools built in to allow you to automate or expedite the different user interface flows that you needed to. So you could use Selenium, but I'll touch on that now. But I remember just telling Skulk that, because at that time I really got into the DOM and I was busy using Python, and I was explaining to him like how difficult I was finding it, and I was basically having to figure out how to write JavaScript in Python to work with the DOM. And Skulk just laughed at me because he said like, why don't you just use JavaScript? But obviously back then, like Python was like the main thing, so I kept sticking with it. But so far, what was really interesting about this, like I think the last kind of firm that I joined before I kind of made a transition to, focus full time on like software engineering, and other related disciplines. I joined a software company as a financial manager, and it was really such a great time, because up until this point in my career, I'd kind of been dabbling with, programming and automation pipelines, but in isolation of peers that program, right? And having joined this software dev house, suddenly I had access to people that were doing this on a daily basis. I could immerse myself. I could ask questions. I got to know that there were things like meetups, and I could kind of get into these meetups and kind of like have these tech talks with people that were in tech. And I think it was kind of at that stage, because I always, when I think back about it, when you're like in a non-tech environment and you like marginally know something about tech, you really feel like you're the person, right? Because everybody around you, IT crowd, like, have you tried turning it on and off again, right, is like revolutionary advice. But really, so for me, it was great getting into this environment, having the opportunity to kind of be in an arena with kind of like these kind of minded individuals. And that was just a great time for me in terms of kind of growth. Because I think one of the big things that like, this was a theme that kind of we touched on earlier, which is, it's all good and well that you've got these automation pipelines, but ultimately it still kind of requires you to instigate, to kick it off, to be the one that kind of just at least as a minimum pulls the information together, and then instigate the pipeline to start running and doing its thing. And you'd have to be there for the next step, or you'd have to be there to bring in the next record, in the example of loading many individuals into a payroll package. And what was really great is this time, these kind of concepts of like a back end and a server, and these things started kind of like lifting themselves from the woodwork in terms of possibilities. Now, back then, I remember like we had conversations about SQL, because there was just no context for that for me yet. But it at least got me into an arena where there was also this concept of like, I can present information, but it always has to go over email or things like this. So I got to at least dabble with like HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and maybe like Apache to like boot up a little static site and like show information out. And specifically, because I didn't mention it, but the reason why I joined the IT company was they basically had gotten investors from outside, and they wanted to bring the accounting function, which was previously done by an outside company. They wanted to bring it inside, so that they had that kind of function inside. But at this stage, I'd spent quite a lot of time like making sure that I've had the cutting edge systems figured out. And it ended up being kind of like a half-day job. And so the other half of the day, I also spent kind of like doing extra things and trying to grow and see where I could go to. I was, as an example, I was the executive of a coffee in the company. That's what I'd say on LinkedIn, but essentially I was just making sure that the coffee beans never ran out, and that there was always caffeine for the company and for us to just keep churning. But as part of the half of that day, yes, that's kind of where I kind of started thinking, but could I maybe do my reports quicker by having, financial information be available real time to the exco and things like that? But about 4 months into that job, it was, I was feeling kind of tired because it was quite hectic. You just changed jobs, and it was over December, so no real break. And, you just had this big haul where you kind of like did the handover, kind of got on your own feet, and I was feeling very deflated. And so I remember that was back when AWS had its first summit in Cape Town. And I ended up going there, and I got so like inspired by all the tech talks and by being wined and dined, as like a potential engineer, because I could obviously go and impersonate one that day. And and so I said, so this is what I want to do. I want to keep working in tech. I don't care if I have sweep the floors of a development house. I want to keep being in this space. And as part of that, I got an opportunity to go for a full year internship, or at least I heard of it and I could start applying to it for a full year internship to go study data science. Long story short, after several rounds of interviews and things, got in, and we made the call to kind of switch. So the year after, at the end of the year, I kind of finished up as the financial manager, and I transitioned across to the kind of data science machine learning space, which is where I kind of picked up Python. And it's really during this time that things really started to pick up, because with all this training and with kind of picking up Python, this was the first time that you were kind of picking up a specific language to be able to do scripts, outside of manipulating macros and things like that. And I also think, because leading into the next chapter, we did a lot of work on natural language processing, and so all these things were kind of like being put together to build what I'm going to talk about next, which is, the freelancer. So towards the end of the year with Explore Data Science Academy, I had built up one or two kind of freelancing gigs. I was kind of flirting with the idea. I thought, this is really where I wanted to go. And as part of this, I had joined a team that was doing a lot of like text to voice processing. And the way they had to do this, and this was all because the tool they were using was doing really phenomenal work in terms of translating the text to speech, and the quality of speech that you got out sounded natural, and the clients were really keen to do it. And what that process basically involved was that you would get a resource of, let's say, 300 pages, and per page you would need to rework this information into the application and select certain options, and then wait for it while it generates the sound clip, and then save the sound clip down to your machine. And then that would be put, let's say, onto Google Drive, where it would then further be reworked and deployed and used. So I think you might be seeing a theme, a recurring theme over here, right? But what was really awesome about this specific build was, up until this point, again, very much in person. You have to be there, to keep the thing churning, even though a lot of it is already now automated. This was the first time that I got the opportunity to now use Python in this example. And with that, I was able to then actually take that resource and load it into the script itself, and then iterate over each of the pages. And the moment I could do that, I could effectively keep running, running and downloading for the full resource length, and not need to be at the computer anymore. So that was really a great transition. But what was quite interesting, and one of the observations was, you during that time and before that time, and especially during the year, you kind of learned about APIs. And because the service, and I think they didn't have an API for specific reasons, but because they didn't have one, that kind of forced the user to now need to work through it like that. They also didn't have a bulk upload or a bulk conversion process via the user interface at all. So they kind of hamstrung the user to need to go through the specific user experience of needing to copy data out in, convert it, and then kind of churn it out, but be present. And so kind of I built the script, and what the script then would do is it would basically do what you as a natural person would do. You copy the text, put it into the form UIs, select the necessary options, download and extract. But it no longer needed anybody to be there. And I think one of my favorite memories with that was I put on a job that was maybe like 300, 600 pages. And we kind of got in the car and we went to the beach, and we had like ice cream and walked with the dogs. And when I got home, the work was done, and you could still invoice as if you had spent the time doing it. Which was like epic. So I think that's also one of the great benefits of this, and that is like this idea, like, wow, you don't need to be in front of the computer to actually have that workload happen. What was also really cool is, obviously, from a vertical scaling perspective, you're kind of limited, because you're limited to either how strong your machine is, to how good your bandwidth is. But a setup like that really allows you to scale horizontally. So, add on an extra computer, add on an extra license to the software, and suddenly you've got 2-3 computer workers kind of like churning away asynchronously, and kind of just working through multiple resources. So you've got this option as a single person to kind of build like full teams of people that kind of do this. And which just brings me back to, I think I chatted with some people that actually needed to do integrations between bank and financial systems, because some banks obviously also lag behind the times, because an enterprise has a tendency to kind of like shift a lot slower than like a startup. Well, not a tendency, it's a fact. And so what they actually needed to do is, some people actually needed to build these little servers that would go in periodically to actually act like a human and download the statement and then pull it into your suite where you wanted to report, because the bank also, again, didn't facilitate an API or something similar. So I guess in that as well, I think one of the insights was as well that I don't think RPA is a final solution. I think RPA actually identifies problems. It actually shows you where there's potential for a better user experience, a better UI design. But at the end of the day, it really is a crutch for those of us that need to expedite certain automation tasks, but we can't wait until the software vendor catches up, or we can't wait until we have a sufficient change of software. This really gives you that ability to go out and say, hey, okay, I know the tool can't do this, but I can do this even though the tool can't. So yeah, that was really awesome. And I think as well during this time, again, I was flirting with the freelance idea, and I was really going out there like, let's do business systems, let's automate more things, let's see if we can make a business of this. But I really quickly kind of started hitting a wall, because I needed to know, how can I sell this as a service, how can I package these kind of things up as a product. And I kept hitting the wall against like, okay, but web app, do you know how to build a web app? Like, what's going on? And so I think at that stage, I kind of said, okay, you know what, this is the experience that I want to chase first. I want to know how to, build servers. I want to know how to launch an app. And, this has been a rabbit hole that's like been very deep, and I'm not even seeing the bottom yet, but I'm really excited to keep going. So yeah, to that. So that was basically kind of the past. So let's talk about the present. And so currently, we kind of what I'm doing right now is software development on a daily basis. But this mindset is kind of still there, right? So you are potentially looking for opportunities to automate, to expedite certain processes that we need to incorporate manual effort rather than automated effort, right? But what is quite nice is when I build, I kind of kept thinking about the kind of like detrimental user experiences that I can potentially introduce, mainly because of having been a user of these kind of user experience, these UIs that kind of facilitate this kind of repetitive, mundane kind of submissions. And so that's been really helpful. Also, in this sense, I can ensure that integrations are added to roadmap, and we could ensure that integrations are added to roadmaps to make sure that where our users need to kind of either push information from our system to another or pull information into our system, that we're aware of those and that we ask those questions and make sure that these are kind of like the things that we do put into the product to kind of prevent the necessity of having somebody do the manual kind of, I'd say, cross-pollination of the information between the two systems. And so also to think about building bulk tools, things like allowing flat files, like CSV files or things to be imported into our suite for bulk record creation. So if we've got a user interface or a user experience where we allow for record creation, let's also make sure to include an ability to do that in bulk, because often you might find that it's cross data capturing between systems. So again, if you can get a list of records from another system, make sure that the ability is there to bulk upload that into a system. So this is kind of like the year now where this is really applicable. Cool. Also, one of the questions that I asked was, I was kind of curious what the kind of attendance tools usage was from a day-to-day basis. And so I specifically listed these tools because what is quite key in all of these tools is they have been designed with a lot of like automation in mind. Specifically, I can talk to Jira and Asana, because both of those are kind of like information and workflow tools. They've built workflow tools inside the workflow tools. So as an example, if you need one task to trigger some changes in another task, ordinarily you would need to remember, okay, if I close this task, I need to go put a comment on another task to let my colleague know that I'm already working on it. So somebody identified that and said, no, let's build a mechanism that allows me to link those two, and on completion of the parent, the dependent automatically gets a message to say, hey, this is done. That happened to me today, and it was so phenomenally good because, again, nobody had to think about it. It was automated, it was sorted. So it's a call again to be sure that we know our tools as well as possible, and to actually spend the time to really understand our tools. Now, when we talk about IDEs, there's a lot of automation and kind of these time-saving tips and tricks in there, right? So we've got emits and snippets and autocompletes all built and baked into our IDEs. There are some really great resources out there that goes into like shortcuts that you can take, and all these various techniques to kind of save time and do these things. But what I really like about us as an industry is when you think about frameworks are kind of pushing for that, right? They're saying, besides all the other facets, but they're saying, how can we expedite prototyping? How can we decrease the amount of mental overhead to do repetitive common tasks? And I think that's probably key to it, is that this is kind of like ingrained in us, I think, in a very fundamental way, and that is like, how can we do things quicker? Like, can I build reusable components and things like that? So it is really close to us, but there's always room for improvement. And I think because we are always subject to certain business processes, because ultimately in business reporting needs to happen and these kind of things is a necessity, it's good to know that there are alternative options. And I think when it comes to, again, back to the question of kind of like browser automation with Selenium is technically meant for front-end testing, right? But because of the way that the front-end testing works is basically impersonating a user using your site and asserting that things happen the way they need to or look the way they need to. It's very easy to go like, okay, but why does it have to be pointed to my site? Can't I point it to somebody else's site and have that script impersonate me, the user, to do a certain task? Okay, so that is the here and now. So looking towards the future, and if you don't recognize this logo, this is the DALI 2 AI system. I think specifically we might have seen some of it in the news. So as an example, they did the kind of like those automatic like image generation. So people would give the system like certain keywords and it would generate phenomenal images like you wouldn't believe. And I think this was something that when I saw it, I was like, okay, wow. Because for the longest time, I think there was this kind of comfort in that, systems and systems automation, couldn't touch creativity because, creativity is an inherent human thing, right? And sure, there are limitations to this, but it can also get you quite close to a final product, or at least an MVP with like a couple of seconds worth of wait. And so this is just, again, it just shows you that there is a lot of this automated thinking, because it's all about, cutting down time, cutting down effort to arrive at the end product. So I just dug a bit deeper because I was interested, because when I went after to look at the kind of image generation, and I kind of arrived at some more services that the makers of this AI system were thinking of. And so here's just a screenshot or two screenshots of like service extracts that they've got there. So you can see that there are, typical things like, well, let's see, like, I think things that caught my eye specifically with things like SQL Translate, translating natural language to SQL queries or vice versa. And I think it's good to note of these things because, A, we could be leveraging them ourselves to make ourselves more productive in the near future. And B, we should probably be aware that these things are out there in terms of where we're putting our manual effort into, to know that there might be an automated solution for that. Okay, so yeah, and essentially that is it. So I think just in closing, I've got some resources, and I would just like to mention that there's this thing that was also kind of introduced to me in 2019, is that there is also a sacrifice to gain when it comes to automation. So time spent versus time saved on automation. I did leave a link in there. It's basically just a table diagram which says, how many times you do the process, how much time you save versus how much time you could theoretically spend automating it. But sometimes, it's just fun to automate things without actually thinking too much about the cost. And then also just to acknowledge, a lot of the icons that I used come from flaticon.com. Many thanks to them. It's always awesome to have some great assets to, build slide decks out with. And yeah, again, thank you so much for everyone's time. Wanted to keep it light. I know many of us do spend time looking at code, and tutorials are always there when we're ready to consume. I hope there's been some value and insight here, and thank you all. I really hope that you have a fantastic Thursday, Friday, and a great weekend. So that's me, Skulk.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Thanks, Jonathan. That was really great. I have so many questions, and I also encourage everyone to ask questions in the text chat, and I'll just kind of read them out. But from my side, I just made so many notes, and I have so many questions, and you kind of dropped that kind of. So I just shared a link to DALL-E. Which is kind of like the tool you were talking about in the end, the open AI tool. And I can do even like an entire session just on that. Wow. I've incorporated it in all my slides that I do with students and so forth. It is just, I think it's scary just to see where automation is and how we're essentially at a point where we can automate illustration. And and I'm saying this as someone who's actually similar to you. I kind of made a career change into the world of tech and so forth. But I think unlike you, when I made the career change, kind of the tech sector wasn't really what it is today. So back when I made the change, front end wasn't even a thing. You were back in the day, you'd say you're a webmaster, which essentially would mean you just maintain the website. So you do all the things, you do the templating, you manage the CMS, you kind of even do the design work, Dreamweaver and whatever.
Was that before package managers, Skulk?
What do you mean package managers?
Like before Node, because we had this phenomenal talk on like what it used to take to get a package in, and how there were like websites where you could physically download a zip file. And was it post that? Okay, no, because I just want to see
that was
what,
before that. That was before like JavaScript really took off. Actually, to be honest, like this is a long time ago. I started getting into this before like around 2008. That's kind of where I started getting into this. So I've just been like riding the wave up until then. And I think most people my age doing this type of thing didn't study it. Because you couldn't necessarily study this, which is always such an interesting thing to share with my students. That a student of mine, he's also quite involved in the FEDSA stuff. He actually does the design work for the graphics and stuff. Dean. So he's actually starting at SnapScan now after graduating. And so he actually said he's the only one in the entire SnapScan team that actually is trained in kind of interaction design. Everyone else there actually just ended up there by kind of just not coincidence, but they ended up there by accident. It's the same. If you talk about Justin, even talking about to Justin Slack, even what his background is, it's insane. Like he doesn't have anything.
Yeah, I mean, fun fact with our team as well. I think we've got kind of like a lot of economics background, like also like economics, other fields. But I think what is really amazing about that is it really is then a decision, right? It's never this thing of, oh, this was just kind of like where I ended up with. This was like we all
Yeah.
made the hard call, like we were on this path. Let's make the change,
Yeah.
and because of that, it's every day is like I chose this. This is what I chose. This is
And the other thing is as well is not to go into too much of a tangent here, but the other thing is as well, like this is actually a really great career for people switching careers because it changes so fast. So like I often tell my students, like, like I'm actually so mad that something like Flexbox exists. Because do you know how long it took me to understand floats, to get floats to not break my website, to be able to use floats in a responsive manner, to do all sorts of weird things with floats, like being able to reorder where something is based on like kind of like with floats alone. Like that's like that is a really hard thing and like a really valuable skill that is now absolutely obsolete. Like being able to proficiently use floats in CSS like is not going to earn me any more money than anyone else. Like, and I had to learn all of that. So I think that's why it's also really great in terms of for people switching careers, because it changes so fast that like someone who's been doing it for 20 years don't necessarily even have a competitive advantage over you. Yeah. But so I think from my side, I'm definitely keen for people to ask some questions around some of the stuff that Jonathan spoke about. But I'm more than happy from my side to also maybe just dive into some stuff. And I actually find it interesting because obviously I didn't have any context about what you're going to be talking about. So you mostly spoke with Silent and so forth. He's kind of usually the go-to guy for kind of setting up the talks and so forth. I saw him like comment in the text chat as well, so he's also here tonight. And honestly, when I saw the topic, I thought you were actually going to talk about like kind of your classic Selenium, like okay, end-to-end testing. That's actually, I was kind of preparing myself for an end-to-end testing talk, and I actually like was wondering, like, okay, cool. I maybe have some questions around like Cypress or Test Cafe or whatever, and now you've completely thrown me, like because like this was not the Selenium talk that I was expecting. But that's
I figured,
amazing.
yeah.
But that's amazing, like, and I think that's unique. And there's probably a lot of like already existing material on how to do end-to-end testing with Selenium out there
Yeah.
on YouTube. Like, we probably don't need another talk on this. Like, to me, this was
Yeah.
so like so much better. And I think there's so many questions I have around that.
I think for me, Skulk, like one of the things that caught me out on the Selenium side of things is back in the days of like retro arcade games with like pixel art and things like that, the artists really found ways to get things done with the frameworks that they were using that nobody thought the framework was invented for. And I think when it comes to Selenium as well, because I've been briefly exposed to Cypress, and I'm planning to dive into it a lot deeper in the coming months and forward. But it was kind of like this sense that I could actually initiate a browser that was controlled with Selenium and basically keep writing lines like press tab, press enter, and then just putting those into loops when you wanted to make it do more than once, those kind of things.
Yeah, so like your traditional end-to-end testing would be like you identify like a very critical path in your app. So you'd be like, for example, let's say we have we're selling shoes. If someone is not able to like log into the site, add a shoe to their cart, check out, and buy that shoe, like that is a massive thing. And if we deploy code that prevents that from happening, we are literally losing money. So what a lot of teams do is they write end-to-end testing where they have a headless browser or Selenium or so forth, or Cypress is the one I've used the most over time, to actually control the browser and go through those steps and see if they can do it on the website, before you're allowed to actually push code live. And, sometimes you actually just have actual people physically sitting and doing that. But as you mentioned, like automation, like makes that like just so much cheaper, just doing that with automation. And the other thing is as well, what I really liked is the fact that you mentioned that there is a cost to automation. And like, I always bring this up, like wherever something seems like a magic bullet, that there's probably some cost. If you don't know the cost, if you're not able to say, if you think there's no cost, you just don't know what the cost is yet. It's that there's that classic XKCD comic where he's like, "Can you pass me the salt, please?" And it's like half an hour later, and he's like, "When is the salt coming?" And like a speech bubble from outside of the screen effectively says, like, just hold on, I'm almost done. I'm building a condiment parser that would be able to pass any type of condiment that you require. And I think the point there being like, sometimes we over-engineer things and we automate things that don't need to be automated.
And it actually came up quite recently that you need to have the discipline to know when to stop. And I think that's a skill that's absolutely worth kind of like fostering and developing, because it's very easy to get into a rabbit hole of like, I just want to solve this and just so I mean, Skulk, I don't know if you can put it up there, but I've just got that kind of graphic that kind of explains the kind of like the duality of,
I can see this also a classic XKCD.
Yes. So this is kind of, but again, sometimes the pursuit of automating it is more fun than actually just grinning and bearing the brunt of actually doing it manually.
And I often tell my students as well, like, there's, that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you want to use actual real things to actually apply skills and learn, but just be upfront with yourself that you're doing this for like educational purposes, and then decide if you want to do it on someone else's budget or you actually want to do it after hours while like in your own time. But like there's a really great article that I have these articles that I always just share with people, share with students and so forth. There's a couple of them. The one is like the law about leaky abstractions. There's one about the boring designer by Cap Watkins. I think he's kind of head of design he used to be head of design at BuzzFeed, I think. Then also there's a really great article by Sandy Metz, who's kind of a big kind of name in the world of Ruby. And the fact that if you know anything about how I feel about Ruby, the fact that I'm sharing that with people despite it being Ruby. It needs to be really good. I'm like, well, sorry if I'm offending any Ruby developers here, but it's not that I don't like Ruby. Ruby doesn't like me. Okay, it just doesn't want to gel with me.
The mutual love.
Anyway, So, but she has a really great article called "Duplication is Cheaper Than the Wrong Abstraction." So I think there's also like a cautionary tale there in terms of making sure that you understand the thing that should be automated. Maybe embrace the duplication and just do that process manually until it reaches a point where you have a very clear understanding of what exactly that is.
And that's such a solid, valid point.
Because if you automate it before actually knowing exactly what you need to automate, and you get it wrong, that's way more expensive than all the time you would have actually spent with automation.
And what you're hitting on is I think what we typically see with like product development, and that is that the sponsor of the project has a specific idea that they want, but it's not as well fleshed out. And so what you end up doing is you head into a direction to kind of put a process into your application just to figure out, but hey, this doesn't make sense, and you need to strip parts out of it, and it ends up costing you so much more than just first having made sure that. But okay, that's agile versus, I guess, waterfall.
But it comes down to the same. But it comes down to the same. It's a question of prioritizing value instead of like just prioritizing work itself. It's so interesting. There's so many software as a services out there, and I think it's maybe because a lot of these cognitive services like OpenAPI, a lot of the kind of like Azure cognitive services in terms of machine learning and face recognition, text to speech, a lot of these things have gotten really good and they've gotten really cheap. So now all of a sudden we're seeing this proliferation of just like all of these kind of tooling that just capitalize on that. And kind of just tie these things together. So what if we could do OCR, but that OCR could be then converted into this thing, and so forth and so forth. So we do see a lot of, like, as you were talking about with accounting, like I've seen a lot of those type of things kind of in the world of engineering and so forth, where people are building like apps and software and so forth, to actually do a lot of, especially the almost the civil codes and legal parts and stuff that are around like engineering, and to create the documents, compile the documents and stuff, which used to be like a very laborious process. I'm actually, a lot of my time nowadays is spent working on a London-based company called Umazi. The name is Zulu, which effectively means to know her. So, but the founder is South African, that's why. And they are actually doing some really interesting stuff. So they are actually kind of automating a lot of the things around due diligence. So if you know anything about due diligence, so essentially it can be summarized as follows: that if you're a company of a certain size, by law you are required to do a bit of research on the other companies that you deal with. So if you're above a certain size and you want to, for example,
you're getting into bed with.
like you need to have all the printers replaced in your office, and you're going to be using ABC printers or whatever to do that. You by law need to do a bit of research in terms of actually like figuring out, like, is this company legit? Like, who's the CEO? Are they vetted properly, and so forth. And so with Umazi, a lot of that stuff's automated. Just because it's one of those things where it's just such a laborious process, and you can just save so much time by automating a lot of stuff, introducing things like OCR and machine learning, and even things around like decentralization, and decentralized identity and those type of things. So it's really interesting that we're kind of seeing this almost like this kind of fervor of like these type of tools like come out now all of a sudden, as the technology is progressing to a point where we start getting like the Dell-E's and even GitHub Pilot, Sure.
I think that's why meetings have increased, right? Because there's now all this spare time that you don't need to do these manual tasks. So now we need to have meetings, because otherwise, why are we here?
Exactly. People are like, okay, I need to start branching out into the things that AI can't replace for job security purposes. And I'm mostly kidding now, but I definitely, with my students nowadays, I very much hammer on the fact that, you need to be cognizant of this stuff. You need to be cognizant of, it's not necessarily that, like automation or machines, the classic thing of machines are going to take your job. But I think it's also the tooling itself is getting so much more advanced that a lot of the more mundane parts of what your job might have involved, it's going to get redundant because the tooling is just getting so much better. So, for example, if you like, just looking at my own career, there's a lot of things that, like building like a very basic like landing page, you needed to know HTML, you needed to probably do a bit of design, and so forth. Nowadays, you can do a lot of that stuff with like drag and drop tooling, Framer, for example, is a good one. Like Webflow is one that's a bit more of a low code than a no code. But even just getting an e-commerce store, Shopify, and that's going to be cheaper than actually hiring someone to build an e-commerce store for you. And I think a lot of those type of low-level types of work, where it was like, okay, you're a developer, I need you to build an e-commerce store for my. For me, I'm maybe selling like handmade crafts or whatever, and I need to sell it online. Can you spin something up for me in kind of Magento or WooCommerce or whatever? I do still think those have their place, but I think a lot of these low-level things, like just a basic e-commerce store, you can actually get it for cheaper by just going to something like Shopify.
And you're spot on, because what I've especially I watch these YouTube shorts, and there's occasionally like these get rich quick scheme videos, but the one guy said, like, here's a side hustle, put yourself
Yeah.
onto Fiverr as a graphics designer and just use
Mm.
Canva and just churn out something that's and I mean, if you think about design system, you think about component libraries, or you think about something
Yeah.
like Tailwind CSS, these are things
Yeah.
that are out there to allow you to be
Exactly.
creative in a way that where you're not like
Yeah.
making amateur
Yeah.
mistakes, because they kind of guardrails in terms of just
Yeah.
layouts and color
Yeah.
choices and things like that. You could churn out some believable and probably
Mm.
economic feasible solutions in terms of a graphics
Mm.
design output, and the same with the
Mm.
low code no code tools. I
Mm.
mean, but again, it's about knowing your tools. I keep feeling like that's like a recurring theme. Even though these tools make it easier, they don't make it
Mm.
like a given. You've still got to go in and do the work and learn to use these tools,
Yeah.
and because the
Yeah.
moment you know how to use them really well, you can actually start using them for purposes that people never thought
Yeah.
that were
Yeah.
possible.
So I think but there's two things. So I think in terms of your career, you should be moving to a space where you're engaging in a lot more, what would be the word, like strategic level of design or development decisions. Because those are really hard, to actually replace with tooling or, AI or so forth. Because it's, so DALL-E, so, like, I encourage you guys, just check some videos on it. It is amazing. So you can literally tell it. So the Fireship one is really great. So he tells it like, draw. I just love the Fireship videos. Like, it's amazing. Yeah, exactly. So like he's like, draw a soup monster that is in the style of a cave painting or as a cave painting, and the stuff it comes up with is amazing. But like, towards that chain, there's someone actually deciding that that's what we need as a solution. And I think that's where you want to be starting to move with your career, where you're making more strategic level decisions. Yeah. So, but yeah, like it's scary times. It's very scary times in terms of AI and so forth. But I'm curious whether you've actually used Selenium or any type of like a browser automation tooling for like web scraping. Have you done any type of web scraping? Okay.
Yes, I have. Again, back then, because I can think of so many better ways to do it right now. Like now I can actually just get an endpoint that's maybe publicly accessible, and I can just
Yeah.
take the payload and I can just pass it, and that's it. I don't have to deal with the way that I did it back then. But yes, back then, because you've got access to the DOM itself, so the full object is loaded into your kind of local environment when you're running the script. I used to actually just pass the full document object into a string, and then I'd use like regex and various techniques to just splice out the parts that I need. Look, it wasn't pretty, but it was effective. And what actually ends up happening is sometimes you stumble across some interesting things. I think I've still got a GitHub repo out there. Was it Hello Peter? I went and scraped Hello Peter as like an idea of like showing, like, because I think one of our machine learning projects was like, can we do sentiment analysis? And I figured, like, what besides Twitter, what other places have like some good sentiment shared on the daily, right?
Hello Peter.
So we hit up Hello Peter, and what ended up being interesting is I think that was one of the first times that I it hit me like, wow, these are all just endpoints being hit with data returned. And Hello Peter on the public side back then, and it might still not be fixed. I think somebody else sent them an anonymous email to tell them, like, hey, you're exposing some sensitive data, because when you actually looked at the payload that was coming back from that endpoint, it had user IPs, it had a lot of like other kind of like sensitive information that, but obviously somebody was just like, hey, let me just send through this full models data to the front end. Let's roll.
Yeah, probably. Like, I've seen a lot of .NET sites like that, where literally the front end is just like a JSON version of the model, and JavaScript is used to create the view straight within the DOM itself. So that the model is in the view, and the view isn't just built from a JSON. It just literally just outputs it as a JSON string. But yeah, like fun times. Like if you've done enough work with government, like those are the type of things you encounter, like on government, like products and websites. Yeah, like I've been there.
Yeah, but and
Yeah.
you mentioned something that's like been a bit of a curiosity. I haven't dug into it too much, but it's not the first time that it's popped up, and that is this concept of launching these things in a headless browser, which is I've always kind of been familiar with actually having the visual browser, because what's quite nice with that, especially as somebody that's kind of still finding their feet, is every single line of code that you execute, you can physically see the result of
Exactly.
that line happen,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
ultimately, once you've finished setting up that pipeline, finished setting up that cycle, you could basically make it headless, because at
Yeah.
that point, I mean, the browser is only there for our benefit as end
Exactly.
users.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's you as a server
Yeah.
communicating with the
No.
server out there, right? So
Yeah. No, for sure. Like, no, like 100%. And, like, so that's also the kind of generally the flow with Cypress, is that you can actually use the Cypress client and you use the GUI to actually do your tests, create your tests and whatever. And then you have a headless version of Cypress that you just install, that you just run as part of your npm run build or your um, GitHub actions tests, or your acceptance tests or whatever. Yeah, I've been having a lot of fun with Puppeteer recently, which is amazing. I don't know if you've used Puppeteer before.
no, but I've seen some cool
Yeah.
things with Cypress where it actually records the failing test, so you can actually
Yeah,
watch a
videos.
video of the. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. So the other one is Test Cafe. I know a lot of people use Test Cafe as well. I think one of the appeals of Test Cafe is that you get a lot more like cross browser. So if you want to test it in like Internet Explorer, like my heart goes out to you, but you can, so you can do those type of things. Whereas I think Cypress is a lot more limited in terms of what you can test. I know a lot of people use Test Cafe as well. Yeah, like to me, Cypress. Yeah, I tend to when I'm testing actual like differences between browsers, I generally do that on a design system level. So I generally just test like the button and that and so forth. I don't test the actual pages of the site. I'm not that phased by it. But like a lot of people like prefer Test Cafe for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you? I was curious, like how would you present like on Cypress? Because one of my concerns with like doing a tool like Cypress is I feel like it tends, or as far as, and this is maybe just from limited experience, but it looks like it's quite dependent on the stack that you implement it into, right? So if I had to come and present on Cypress, it would be very much like a Laravel Vue kind of intersection, because that's where I tend to use it. But maybe how do you think there's a way to present Cypress in a generic fashion where, because again, I guess you want to come and communicate like what do you want to call it, like concepts that aren't necessarily relevant just within a stack, but
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think, like, so effectively, Cypress, I think what makes Cypress really powerful is, unlike Selenium, Cypress just said, you know what, we're actually just, like, technically, Cypress is a browser. They've just effectively built their own browser that's specific for user testing. For automated testing.
kind of
So
like SARS
effectively,
did to keep their forms loading.
yeah, exactly. Effectively, that is what it is. So effectively, like it's a browser that you can just automate. So if you are able to spin up like a local instance or a staging instance or whatever, you run it against that. And so how you do that isn't necessarily a big issue. I think like the bigger questions would be, so I think so you mentioned Laravel and so forth. I think it's a bigger question is maybe around, for example, like monolithic versus kind of more decoupled structures. So that might be it might be harder in a super monolithic structure like Laravel, where you essentially need to spin up everything just before you
Yeah,
can
the
test the
scaffolding
color.
is quite intense.
Yeah, just before you can test the color of a button. In order to see if that button is actually purple, you need to now literally have an entire database that you spin up. You need to sign in. You need to go through. Whereas with things like Storybook and so forth, the way I tend to work in a very kind of like decoupled manner. So I can just spin up that little like button, and I can show it in loading state, and I can show it in whatever state, and so forth. That's a lot easier to test. So I think like that's usually where your problems are going to be. But I actually think Cypress would be more well suited for something like Laravel because, yeah, I don't know, like that to me seems more like a process problem than an actual technology problem. But if you have a staging site, like that's probably what you want to hit against. You probably want to hit
Yeah,
like some type of staging site.
something that's already kind of scaffolded. No, that's actually a good point.
Yeah. I can put you in touch with some people. I know. I know a lot of people who like actually purely just work in the testing space. There's a good friend of mine who also he actually used to work for. I think when he was in the UK, he used to actually work for EA, and he used to like do like automated testing for like games and things as well, which is super exciting. But yeah, like it's such a phenomenal, it's such an interesting space. Um, yeah, I also like what you kind of mentioned about how like almost you encountered programming before you even decided to go into programming. And to me, given that we already talked about AI and we're talking about kind of like brave new worlds. Like I find it so interesting that we're seeing programming proliferate just like everywhere. I have friends who, like, I have a couple of friends who are in medical research, so their background is actually in medicine. They studied at like Tigerberg campus, so they're trained to be like doctors or whatever, and now they're kind of in a more research role, and they're just writing Python day in day out. And to me, that's such a weird thing. Like, they went to go study medicine and now they're writing Python. Just
Yeah,
because,
same thing. My brother is
mm,
studying psychology, industrial psychology, but during his thesis, he had to pick up R, right? Because
yeah, exactly.
as part of kind of
Yeah,
like their analysis and their statistical stuff, they need
yeah,
to have that skill set because you need to be kind of like doing what let's call it statistical analysis at this level. You need to
yeah.
be leveraging these technologies because if you're not doing it, a peer somewhere else is going to be doing it, and that's going to
Yeah,
give
yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
an
yeah.
advantage.
No, 100%. And even a lot of my friends within like kind of I have a couple of friends who work at like Alan Gray and like Sunlum and so forth, and a lot of them like had to learn programming. Just in terms of risk, assessing risk and models and things, and it's so interesting that like there's definitely, so for those of you that don't know, I have a 10-month-old daughter, and like like she should enjoy this time before I'm forcing her to learn JavaScript, while she's still a kid and she can just kind of play around outside and not worry about JavaScript. But enjoy it while it lasts, because I swear when that kid can use a computer, like she is going to start programming. I don't even care if she wants to become a professional ballet dancer or whatever. Like she's going to learn how to program, because I just think like it's such like good literacy to have going into the world that's ahead of us, even if just for automation purposes. I think as the other example, so I'm currently teaching some of my design students. We're kind of doing data visualization, and like so I essentially like so I just came like so I was like, okay, cool, I need them to practice something. And so I initially I thought about sending them to something like a Kaggle or something, or where can find like big data, but like a lot of those things are like dirty and require some like cleaning up of the data, and it's hard to make sense of the data, and like there's massive limits on the data. So if you're a designer and you just want to practice data visualization, like it's such a pain to work with actual real data. So I just thought, like, you know what, I'm just going to create like a massive data set for them on paranormal activity. like fake paranormal activity. So, 3 zombies were spotted in Cape Town at this date, and the temperature was this and whatever, and a vampire was spotted in Bloberg, and just like spottings of paranormal activity, and aliens were reported over Johannesburg at this GPS location and whatever. And so I literally just wrote a little script. I used faker.js to just generate like random things like city names.
After you took it over, Skulk.
No, I'm actually thinking of, so like there's other people that are doing a much better job than I am. So I'm actually thinking of merging some of my stuff into theirs. But yeah, like it's just generating tons and tons of fake information. And so I effectively generated a CSV of like thousands and thousands of rows of like fake information. And like I'm always just impressed like how fast computers are able to do those type of things. I literally pressed the button, 2 seconds later I had like just like an Excel file with loads of populated fake information, just according to parameters that I just set in terms of kind of what it can fill those cells with. So like even there, like just as a lecturer, like being able to program, like if I had to now go and create fake data for my students to actually design, like there goes an entire Saturday afternoon. So yeah, like it's just such an incredible thing, and I think automation really is at the heart of it. To me, web scraping is one of those things where it's always like I can't, like I always get excited when I teach people web scraping, because it's just like it feels like such a superpower. It's so easy to do, and all of a sudden you're just like, whoa, all the things I can build with this, all the things I can do now that I can scrape the web. Sure, it is amazing. Yeah. So yeah. But yeah, I think that is about it. I'm curious whether you maybe have, because this is obviously a topic that it's quite something that's being discussed quite a bit, like automation, specifically in this time, in kind of like syllabization. So I obviously have some great books that like I can recommend in terms of, or just like actual videos, or even just a Netflix series or something in terms of these type of things. Is there anything that like you think is like really great to kind of read or watch or so forth on these type of things, that is a bit more than just, hey, this is how to set up Selenium?
Yeah, I think there is and I'll I always feel like people are like, oh no, Python, like I can't learn Python, but it is such an approachable language.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
having been through like several different languages, both front end focused and back end focused, I would still recommend going and having a look at automating the boring stuff with Python, and it'll be part of the resources that I'll send out from my last slide. But it's such a fun book. Even if you want to, if you've got a friend or somebody that wants to get into Python or into programming as a concept, because again, like if you think about teaching programming to children, they do Scratch because it's age appropriate. I feel like automating the boring stuff with Python is age appropriate for any adult that's like doing an admin job. So that's one Skulk I'd recommend.
Oh, awesome! I think it's a Starch Press book, is it not?
I think so.
It's the publisher.
Yeah, a phenomenal writer, a great like sense of humor. I found.
Actually, let me just actually add a link in the. Well, let's see who finds it first.
I've got the actual link. So they've got so Skulk, it's over there. It's in StreamYard's chat.
Yeah, it is. It's Starch Press. So that little like you'll see, it looks like an iron in the corner. That's the publisher. They have amazing books. And honestly, like their books are on sale almost constantly on Humble Bundle. There is like not a time that I go on Humble Bundle that there isn't like some type of Starch Press sale. or O'Reilly sale. But I think this one you can get for free online, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it a paid for one?
No, it's free. It's free online.
Yeah.
I think at some stage, but it's free to read under the CC license, as it says at the
Yeah.
top of the. But it's really fun. I think in terms of getting your feet wet in programming, learning something that you can really use in your daily life, and as a starting point to keep you motivated and give you actual projects to work through that'll have tangible benefit really quickly. It's like Skull said, the moment he teaches you web scraping, you've got the superpower and you can suddenly see all these opportunities, and there's no better way to learn than through a project.
Yeah. Okay, great. It doesn't seem like there are many questions from those that attended. I always say, that always makes me very nervous, because either like I just spouted so much nonsense that no one is able to form any coherent question based on, they don't even know what I talked about, or I just did such a good job that there actually isn't anything left to ask. Everything is self-explanatory. So let's hope for the latter.
Yes.
But when there aren't many questions, it's one of the two extremes. There's no middle ground.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy if every attendee, even if they could just leave with one thing to think about or to mull over, even if it is how can I do better talks, just leave with something that you can build on. But no, it's been swell, and I think it's good for me too. It's like this is a first, so at least you can learn and grow from that. So that's also good.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. If it wasn't clear, I had the time of my life. So at the very least, I was getting a ton of value from this.
We always love discussing ideas and things that are out there. The strategic minds and the future seekers. Yeah.
Where can people get in touch with you if they have any questions, or they want to learn more about this, or so forth, or learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think feel free to reach out on Slack. If you're not on ZA Tech yet and you're interested in the tech industry, or you're in the tech industry, please join our Slack group. It's really awesome. So you can reach me there. I do have Twitter, although I'm not yet in the space where I'm really engaging across Twitter, I think the idea is. But I'd say ZA Tech is probably perfect. If you're interested in this, again, maybe we can find some time to actually also sit together if you're curious. That would also be quite cool. But yeah, Skulk, I think that's about the gist.
Oh, yeah, so I just also popped a link. So ZA Tech, that's ZA as in South Africa tech.co.za. If you're not on there, it's actually, we don't have any affiliation with them, but I guess I'm an admin on there, but in terms of fates overlap, there isn't really. It's just a great place in terms of actually just networking with people and so forth. So if you're not on there yet, definitely join it. Awesome. But yeah, I'll leave the rest of you guys to be on your way. You are released. Thanks for joining us. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was really great. And yeah, for those of you that are in Cape Town, I hope I see some of you in person on Saturday. Jonathan, are you coming?
I am unable to, but I will definitely be there with spirit. Look, I've attended 2 out of 2, so I think I can.
That is true.
But it is really great. So I can recommend it. It's really good. I'm actually a little bit sad because I think this round is an avenue that I'd like to personally develop, and that's a little bit of the design and things like that. But I'm sure we'll get good feedback and cliff notes, about the sessions.
So Jonathan has an excuse. He literally just presented a talk 3 days before, so that's why I don't know what excuse the rest of you guys have. But I better see you over
Mike
there.
Tyson. What does he do after a fight? He rests. Let's
exactly. Going head to head with me. Cool. All right, everyone. Have a great evening. And then if I don't catch you on Saturday, I'm hoping that I'll chat with some of you again on Wednesday. We will chat about React and how to structure React projects. All right. Awesome. Cool. Have a great evening, everyone. Cheers.